everybody. As you're all logging into this wonderful webinar, welcome to the National Widowers Organization and the Men's Grief Network monthly webinar. And today we're talking about the topic of guilt. With our webinars, we seek to provide grief support to those who have lost a spouse, partner, child, or any significant loved one. The NWO is a nonprofit group bringing men together in grief. So I am NWO board member Adam Larson. I'm a widower and your host for tonight. So tonight we have a very special treat for you. Eric Adams is with us, and he's going to be describing his experiences dealing with guilt after feelings after the death of his son. And then that will be followed by grief and loss educator Greg Williams, who will be discussing common guilt challenges men face and offering strategies and solutions. After their conversation, we're going to go through some Q&A. So please send in your Q&A into that Q&A box in the session. Send them anytime throughout the event. But after Greg and Eric are going, we'll jump in and start answering some of those questions. So we're really excited to get started. So Eric, we're going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Eric Washington, and I'm just here tonight to share my grief story with you all. So I'll start by saying that December 12th, 2015 is when I got the call from my son's mother that my son had passed away. My wife and I at that time were out Christmas shopping, and I had just bought gifts for my son and for my daughter, and then I got the call. It was like a frantic call, and she was yelling, and she said Eric passed, Eric died, and I said, I can't hear you. I heard her, but I didn't want to hear her. So I said, I can't hear you. I'm going to step outside, so we can talk. And when we stepped outside, that's when she said it again, that Eric passed. And I was just in shock and crying and yelling and screaming. And I remember I got down on my knees in the parking lot, and after I stopped and I kind of was trying to compose myself. I remember asking her. I said, how did this happen? What happened? And she said that he died from an asthma attack. So yeah, 2015. So that's about eight years ago, I want to say. And that's when my life changed drastically, and everything after that, I call it my new normal, like the new norm. Greg, is there, in reference to what I'm speaking about now, is there anything like specific that you wanted me to get into, or?
Yeah, Eric, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And of course, even though it's been, over 8 years, condolences again for you and your family. That's just a huge loss to have to experience. And tonight, I think one of the things we want to really focus in on is how many people in their grief experience, have some feelings or thoughts of guilt.
Mm.
And talk later about some ideas about how to think about that, or maybe approach that might be helpful. But I wonder about your experience, if you had some of those experiences or thoughts of guilt when you were having to deal with the loss of your son.
Yeah. Yeah, guilt always, seems to pop up when I think about Eric Jr. His name was Eric. I named him after myself.
Mm.
When I think about it, it's always, why did he have to pass? And, like, why am I still here? Because,
Mm-hmm.
Eric, my son got asthma, I believe it was from my side of the family, because I have asthma. So right away, I'm like, that guilt with asthma and him dying, it's just like, it's just like a constant reminder. Like I always think in my head that I gave him that,
Yeah.
and that was my firstborn, my firstborn son, and I that guilt is it definitely messes with me a lot. So again, it's like why am I here and he's not? Because my asthma was like 12 times worse than his was.
Mm-hmm.
And I was born in 71, right? I'm 52 years old. So medication wise, it wasn't as advanced as it is now. Like he had, you know, great doctors. He was, he had the medications that actually work, not like I had. Like I had to be in intensive care.
Mm.
It was something, I forget what it's called, but I was like in a hospital bed and they zip the bed up and they pump like oxygen and the medicine into that, into that area so I can breathe
Right.
that. I had to get shots, needles, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
for medication, just to breathe. And it was really crazy for me, and I came out just fine.
Yeah.
So to have that happen to my only son is just it's really hard. Um, yeah, it's just really hard. Like I don't. It's hard to talk about because I have to relive it again.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times I'd rather I try. I don't want to say I try to forget, but it's easier to deal with life if I don't remember that.
Yeah.
Like, so it's easier to go to work and deal with my job responsibilities, to deal with my home responsibilities. Um, my when I'm off work, I like to work out. I go to the shooting range. I do a lot of stuff to not think about, the loss of my son.
Yeah.
Um, my wife and I, like, I've moved forward. I've advanced so much as far as my career is concerned. Since my son died, my wife and I, we bought our first home since my son died. We've gone on, some fantastic vacations since my son died. And just even that, though, just moving forward with my life, trying to not think about him so much, it makes me feel guilty as well because I'm doing all of this.
Yeah.
I'm living and he's not here. Like I can't include him in it. I try to include my daughter in almost in a lot of stuff, because since he passed, like I made it a point to actually do more with her, since he's gone because you always hear the phrase life is short, but I don't think you really know what that phrase means until you lose somebody. And
Yeah.
especially to lose somebody at 23 years old.
Yeah.
He was only 23. So it's just, it's something that I wish never happened. But it did. And I do believe that I'm stronger because of it. But that is like the only thing that I've ever gone through that's actually like brought me to my knees, like,
Yeah.
to humble me because I've been, straightforward. I don't let anything affect me. I'm a Taurus. I don't know if that has anything to to do with it, but I'm real headstrong, real stubborn. If you let my wife tell it, if you let my daughter tell it also, I'm kind of stubborn. Um, but yeah, but that my son passing is one of the only things that brought me to my knees. It made me realize that that life is not, it's not as long as people may think it is, and you don't, or you may not necessarily get the time to do what you want to do in reference to loved ones or even if it's just like taking a trip, somewhere. So
Mm-hmm.
I my wife doesn't necessarily agree with this, but since my son died, as long as my responsibilities are taken care of, I live life. Like I do what I want to do. You know, I go where I want to go. I buy whatever I want to buy. It doesn't matter what it is. As long as, you know, the bills are paid and everything is fine, I'm not, you know, neglecting my home, you know, or my wife or my daughter or family or, you know, as long as everything is done, if I have extra, I'm gonna live life because we don't know, you know, if this is gonna if tomorrow is gonna come. Tomorrow's not promised. Um, since my son died, I say today is not promised. Like today is not promised. Right now, it's what is it? It's like almost a quarter to nine. Um, Thursday morning is not promised. You know, 10 o'clock tonight is not promised. Like we don't know what can happen. So I try to live life to the fullest.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eric. You know, I hear in so much you're saying that what some things I've heard that reminds me of what some things I've heard from other parents who've had children die about that it's really hard to think about that their life is shorter than our lives.
Right.
And it doesn't feel right, you know, in that regard. And I wonder if part in your experience, if the guilt part and the grief has been part of what makes it challenging to face forward because it kind of drags you back to looking backwards. At least
Yeah.
I've seen that with some other people. And I wonder if that's been similar in any way for you.
100%. 100%. Just doing this, you know, tonight, I wanted to share my story because you never know, you know, who your testimony, because I think it's a testimony. You never know who your testimony can actually help, but it just brings me back to 2015.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so when we get off of this Teams, you know, tonight or Zoom tonight, I hope, you know, that someone, you know, someone hears me and someone can be inspired to move forward because time does heal. Time does heal, right? But even though you may heal and you may be able to move on, you're never gonna forget. And it can be the
Mm-hmm.
the slightest thing that can bring that pain back up, like full, you know, like 100%. It can be a song. Um, for me, it's hard for me to watch a movie like where I see like a young, you know, boy that has passed, and if they show the boy in the morgue, that like I lose it because when
Mm-hmm.
I went to the hospital to see my son when he passed, they were preparing him to go to have an autopsy. So they were preparing him for that, and they said that I couldn't see him, and you know I almost lost it. Well, I kind of I did lose it, you know, and I was yelling at them, and you know I hope it wasn't personal. I hope they understood that I was just in so much pain, but I told them like my son is not leaving this hospital until I see him, you know, because in my mind he wasn't dead, right? It was, you know, my son's mom was just like playing a bad joke on me, you know, or something. She was just being mean
Mm-hmm.
or whatever. Like my son was not dead
Yeah.
until I saw him and saw, you know, can see that he was gone.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't gone.
Yeah.
So I had to go to the morgue, you know, in the hospital. And until that day, I didn't realize that hospitals had morgues. I didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they have a separate part of the hospital for people that die.
Yeah.
But it's something that you don't think about. You know, you don't think about these things if you haven't experienced loss. And I had to go in the room, and he was in this in one of those freezers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And they had the drawer open, and I was able to see his beard, you know, he was 23 and this was in 2015. And I don't know what it was with all the young, the young men in 2015, but they all was like growing their beard, you know, to look like this, like a like a shoehorn kind of thing. It was like a long, it was so I always told him to cut it. I used to tell him that he looks homeless. You know, that's just like father and son stuff. I told him cut that. It was ridiculous. But when I went into the morgue and they had like the bag open that he was in, that's what I saw sticking out.
Yeah.
You know, I saw that beard, and then that's when it hit me that that's my son in there. You know, and I walked over to him and I just stared at him. You know, and that was very hard. You know, I don't even want to continue talking about that, but that was very hard.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, just one of the things that helped me get through was I started a blog in 2018. I started writing about it because I wanted people, you know, to hear my story and like hear it from my eyes, like what I actually went through. So it was very vivid, you know, it was real, it was in your face. And then as I started, you know, praying on it and I started going to church, I believe that the Lord wanted me to write a book. And I turned the blog into my book, you know, and you know the book is out there, the book is selling, you know, people are reading it, and you know I just hope that people can get something from it.
Yeah.
You know, because I got something from it. It like let me release all of the hurt that was in me. You know, it's still there, but I was able to release it,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
through writing.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Eric, and even sharing that very difficult experience of, you know, being present with your son's body. I think that really does emphasize so many of our experiences, how important it is, even though how painful it is, you know, to have that experience, to really know kind of deep in ourselves that that person has died,
Mm.
and seeing that body and knowing it, you know, all the way in our gut makes a huge difference, even though it hurts so much. I know that they're wanting to that part of the request tonight is for me to share a few thoughts on the guilt part, and I want to throw a few things out and then see what your thoughts are on that.
Okay.
To see, you know, maybe some of them will connect to your experience, and not all of them might, of course. We're all different,
Okay.
but we'll see what you think. And I'll start by saying, you know, my work, I'm a social worker, and I've worked in a children's hospital for about 33 years, and I've worked with a lot of parents who have had someone die. And then I work with a grief program where we've had people come because their spouses have died or parents have died, and friends and other family members. And so, but when I was working with parents who had a child die through illness or injury, it really struck me just how often it was that they felt guilty.
Mhm.
And sometimes I think that happened beforehand if they were dealing with an illness or a hospitalization. And I think there's that part of us, I'm a parent too, and there's that part of us as parents that we feel like, you know, our job is to help our kids grow up and live a long time and live healthy and long and longer than we live.
Right.
And if they don't do that, even if it's not our fault, we can still feel like we failed them in some way. And I think that sometimes, you know, men and as fathers and husbands and nowadays that our job is to provide and sometimes to protect, and to advocate for people, that can really be a hard thing. And I used to think that, you know, if you could trade places with her, you know, with somebody, you know, we wouldn't have a children's hospital. We'd have a parents and grandparents hospital, because there'd be a line of people who would step up to take their place.
Right.
And but then I found out that, you know, that guilt affected people, so many other people too. When I work with teenagers and kids, and we talk about how people feel when somebody dies, they always come up with guilt. And so I think I don't think it's just for parents. It is for parents in special ways, but I think it's for spouses and kids, whether you're an adult child or a child. And so there's some ideas that have seemed to me to be potentially helpful, even though it may be something that people wrestle with or end up carrying in some degree for the rest of their lives. Well, I'd like to think that it's possible always to just make it all go away 100%, but I don't think that's true for everybody. But I think it can be better. But one of the ideas that has really been helpful to me, there's a therapist and writer named Jack Jordan, and he works a lot with families after suicides. And one of the things that he says is that in those situations that families almost always have to put themselves on trial. But so the key is you may not be able to avoid putting yourself on trial. Is there something I could have done? Is there something that I contributed to this? Is there something I could have done to prevent it? But the key is to try to make it as fair a trial as possible. And he said one of the ways that we don't make it a fair trial, and we do this, I do this, I think most people I know do this, is what he called the tyranny of hindsight. It's where something happens in the past, and we look back at it with everything we know now, and we hold ourselves responsible for understanding in the past everything that we know now, which is impossible because we can't know everything then that we know now. We're going to know something next week we don't know today. But we do that, and that's not a fair trial. Right. And so to try to avoid that part. And then there's another idea in that fair trial part is that, whenever we don't have good explanations for things, like you expressed, so honestly, that, the question of why would this happen? And when we don't have explanations, we still feel like we need a story. We need to fill in the gaps and fill in those blanks. And so sometimes we feel the need to have that story and to fill in those blanks so much that we'll fill them in a way that it's not really true or not really fair or accurate. And sometimes we do it that way because it's early and we just don't know everything yet. And so that first draft story that we have is often not a very good draft but we need a draft. We need some kind of story and explanation. And there's one writer, she puts it like, that first draft we write is a pretty bad draft. She says, in fact, the word she uses to describe it rhymes with pretty. And she said, that's the kind of draft we have in the beginning. And I think she's right, is that oftentimes our first draft really is pretty lousy. And so it's helpful, I think, if we can hold that draft really loosely so that we can revise it and correct it and improve it over time. So we don't have to get stuck with that first story that we told ourselves, oh, maybe it was me, or maybe it was their fault, but it wasn't. Maybe it was my thing, but it wasn't. But we could be tempted to do that. I think another thing that people sometimes do that can help is sometimes we feel like we owe a debt. We've done something, we didn't do something in the world, maybe we caused some harm, we didn't prevent some harm. And so we have a debt to pay. And that makes sense in some ways. If I was at your house and I hit your car, I would need to fix your car, right? And that would be the right thing to do. I need to apologize and I need to fix your car. Now, what happens, I think, for sometimes when we try to pay a debt is sometimes we'll tell ourselves that, well, I'm just going to pay a debt I'm going to suffer. I'm just never going to be happy anymore. And that's when I'm going to pay my debt. Well, that actually doesn't help very much. And if I hurt your car and I said, Eric, I'm so sorry, I hurt your car, I'm never going to feel good about that the rest of my life. You might say, well, Greg, that's all right, but that doesn't fix my car. And, and so, if we're going to pay a debt, I think we have to do something positive in the world. And we don't pay a debt by living a small life. We pay a debt by living a generous life and a big-hearted life. And so that helps. And then sometimes, maybe having a fair trial doesn't help some, but doesn't help everything. We still carry that. Maybe we're trying to pay a debt off, but that doesn't take us all the way. And I remember I heard a dad speak years ago, and his son had died with a medical condition. And he said, I felt guilty about it. And he was a pastor too and a counselor. And he said, I felt guilty about it. And everybody said, you don't need to feel guilty. He said, but I did. I felt guilty. He said, what I needed somebody to tell me was that, I hear you say you're feeling guilty, but I don't think you have to be guilty, but I hear you say you do feel guilty. So what I want you to know is that I forgive you. I think what he was saying, at least to me, is that he needed some experience of forgiveness, because sometimes we can't let ourselves off the hook. And so if we can't find a way, if the debt's too big to pay, if we can't put ourselves on trial and say we're not guilty, then we may have to seek and see if there's a way that we can feel forgiven. And one of the ways that we've seen that in our grief program, and other people have written about this too, is that we do a thing at the end of our grief program, grief support groups for their adults and our teenagers, where we invite them to write a letter to the person who died, and really imagine if they could really get it. What would you want to say? What would you want to ask? Would you want to say something you never said before? Would you want to say something brand new? Would you want to say something you've said before, but you got to say it again? So write that letter. So they write that letter, and then we ask them to use their imagination even more and say, now imagine wherever they are, your person is, if they got this letter and they wrote you a letter back, what would they say? Knowing them as you know them. And so we invite them to write that letter back to themselves. And what we find, because sometimes people share about that letter, sometimes it's too private and they don't say a lot. But the people who share about it, often there's forgiveness in there. Sometimes it's forgiveness for the live person to the dead person. Like, I know you tried, or I know you messed up, but I want you to know I forgive you. Or sometimes it's the dead person forgiving the live person and saying, I know you love me. I know you didn't want it to go this way. You couldn't have done anything about this. Or if you made a mistake, I want you to know that it's okay now. And I think there's some ways that happens too, that whether it's through that letter writing or through that connection with that person. And it strikes me that when we think about ourselves and about how we feel guilty and we kind of hold ourselves responsible, that one way to think about it too might be that maybe we're mistaken. Maybe our conclusion is not right, because we're human and we can make mistakes. And I remember I had a math teacher in high school, and he was great. He could explain everything to me. I always could understand it, except one time. And he was trying to explain something about some multiple dimensions. I could not get it. And I kept asking him, but how could that be? But how could that be? And only one time he said, Greg, he said, is it possible that there's a situation where you could be wrong? And I said, yes. And he said, this is one of those times. And I said, okay. And we went on. And I wonder sometimes if maybe it's helpful to think that we might be wrong. And maybe it's not all our responsibility as much as we thought. And then the last thing I'd offer, and then I want to see what your thoughts are, is that if we can't, if we do all the things we know, and we try to be as fair as we can to ourselves and not be stuck with that lousy first story, but try to tell a more fair story, and we maybe try to put some good into the world to make up for what we wish we could have done, but we just couldn't because it was in the past. Maybe we seek some experience of forgiveness, and that helps, but it doesn't help as much as to take it down to zero. Then I think there could be a place at least to give ourselves some compassion, because it's hard to carry that. It's a hard thing to carry. And when we give ourselves compassion, we remind ourselves that this is hard and this is a place of stress, and it's heavy, and a place of suffering. And we remind ourselves that we're not the only ones. Other people have struggled with this. And we're a unique person. Nobody's like us, but other people have had to deal with this too. And then we try to be as kind to ourselves as we would to somebody that we cared for. And if somebody we cared for was struggling with guilt, we wouldn't say, well, the reason you're feeling guilty is because you're just a lousy person. We wouldn't say that to that friend or that family member we loved. And so if we could try to be kind with the message we give ourselves to say, this is just hard. And I'm sorry you're having to go through this. And I'm sorry that you're having to carry it. I wish that we could help people not feel guilty just by saying you don't need to feel guilty. If that was true, then we could just say that and snap our fingers and be gone. But it's more complicated than that. And it's deeper than that. But I think that there are ways that we can think about it and even be honest about, this is what I did. I did the best I could in these ways, some other ways. Okay, I didn't do this. Look, I wish I would have done better. And looking back, if I could have done it differently. But I can at least try to be kind to myself in the middle of that. So I'm going to stop and just ask you what struck you about any of those ideas, Eric?
In reference to that letter, right?
Yeah.
The griever writes that letter.
Mm-hmm.
And then you write the response of what you think the person that passed away would say.
Yes.
The issue that I have with that, the issue that I mean, I guess in theory, that's okay, but
Mm-hmm.
in reality, the problem is death is final, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can't, wake the person up that passed away and say, before you go, right? Before this is final, I just need to know, you know, did you love me? Do you love me? Did I do everything I was supposed to do as a parent? And it's just that not knowing,
Mm-hmm.
what your loved one thought
Yeah.
about you at the time, of his passing. That haunts you. That haunts me.
Yeah.
I think, that I was a good dad.
Mm-hmm.
I became a father early, like way too early. I was not ready.
Mm-hmm.
My son was born when I was 21 years old. So
Mm-hmm.
I was a kid myself, but being a kid myself, I was always a responsible person. And I always tried, to do the best by him. But just the not knowing since he's gone,
Yeah.
what he felt about his dad,
Yeah.
that kills me. And that ties in to the guilt.
Right. Oh, I think you put that so well. I think that's one of the hard things, and it really is an imaginational thing where, when people do that,
Mm-hmm.
is they're trying to use that imagination, and at least for what I've seen, the experience of it, when they, if they want to go there, they don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
But if they go there and just imagine, knowing that they might not, there's no way to know that they're right or not. But I've been impressed with people who, when I'll ask a question and I'll say, well, which was a harder letter to write? And sometimes, or what was it like to write the letter? And they say, I knew what he would have said back to me.
Mm-hmm.
After I got into it, I can kind of hear him, what he would say. And I can't say that for everybody, but I hear that a lot.
Okay.
And Greg, that's a great segue, because we did get a question from the audience, and someone's father died a few years ago, and they had their relationship was much conflict, and they never really resolved it before they died.
Yeah.
And they don't really know how to deal with that. And somebody said, "Oh, just stop thinking about it." But it's like, they don't are there any better techniques? I think what you just mentioned might help this person, but if you wanted to offer any other advice.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. I think you're exactly right that if we could just do that, if just stop thinking about it work, then that would be really a simple world. But that's not a real world, because when we leave when we don't get a chance to say all the things we wanted to say, and or when we leave it badly because there was unresolved conflict. I think that's where some of those communications, and whether it's sometimes whether it's through a writing exercise, sometimes even with the help of a counselor in an imaginary conversation, which sounds kind of strange at first, but if some people can get to that place, and the idea is that we still have a relationship with that person even after they died. Their life on this earth has ended, but our relationship to them has not. And so we can still work on that relationship because they're still part of our life. And so there's potential for that relationship to be different or better. It's complicated because they're not with us physically, but it's possible because the relationship has not ended, and it doesn't have to be stuck in the status that it was when the person died.
Yeah, that's not easy at all. We had another audience member who kind of feels really conflicted because this person was in charge of their wife's medications and may have misdosed something, and then she died like a number of hours later, and it could have been it probably wasn't, but he feels this really heavy guilt, and just can't help it. And like, what advice would you give him?
Yeah, that's a great point. That sometimes we tell people, well, it's not your fault, but sometimes we don't know. You know, maybe I could have done something. Maybe if I would have been more careful. And so it's not fair just to put somebody in that place to say that we know that they had nothing to do with it, because life is complicated. And so then part of it, I think, would be to try to be as fair as possible as you go through that, kind of weighing it out. This is what I did. This with the information that I knew at the time. This is what I did in the best way I knew. And then try to be as fair and looking back to say, I think that these are some things I wish I would have done differently. And be willing to sit with that, to know that both of those could be true. And then there may be a place, depending on that person, whether it's in their relationship with that person who died or maybe in their spiritual tradition, there may be a place there for an experience of forgiveness, that I just couldn't do everything I wanted to do. And I wish I would have. I can't go back and change it now, but what can I do now to be helpful? And some people we know have what they have done is they've tried to do something good in the world. I don't want somebody else to go through what I went through, so I'm going to look for some ways to help other people, and to learn from this to help other people. And it won't erase what happened, but it can help me to honor that experience in a way that I can feel better about it.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, Greg, because it's difficult to overcome those things, but sometimes doing that action really helps. And I think when you lose somebody, there's always the what ifs that go through our minds. And Eric, I know you shared that a little bit, and it's like you have those what ifs that happen so many times, and
Yeah.
it's a battle just to walk through all the what ifs, because you can't get lost there, but if you don't acknowledge them somehow, it'll just fester.
Right. Yeah. And that, Adam, I think to me, that really was what I was hearing with what Eric was kind to share earlier, that I think that one of the real pitfalls or the tricky parts of guilt and grief is it just keeps us looking backwards. It makes it hard for us to live full lives in the present and and be open to the future while not forgetting the past. Because we feel like we're either looking backwards because we're stuck with looking back and feeling bad about it, or we look forward by trying to ignore the past. And neither of those are really realistic, very practical options for us.
Mm.
And sometimes it's easier to try to forget.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you can't. But sometimes it's easier to try to forget.
Yeah.
It doesn't work though.
Yeah. And that's where I really believe in that idea. And I like that the people who've talked about self-compassion comes in, because while we're wrestling with this, and while we still may hope we could find a better way to carry it, a more graceful way to carry it in the future, at the present, we may not be able to, as we're in the middle of it. And so just to be able to be kind and supportive of ourselves, to say, I'm having to deal with a hard thing. And that deserves some support. You know, somebody explained this compassion idea to me one time, and they said, you know, you don't give your kid, you know, you don't comfort your kid when they're having the flu to make the flu go away. You comfort your kid when they have the flu because it sucks to have the flu. And sometimes we can comfort ourselves and support ourselves, not to make us feel better, but just because it sucks to be in the place we're in.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think we have time for about one more question here. One of our audience members, his wife died of ovarian cancer. And, you know, they were trying to do different alternative therapies. And after she passed, he realized he wished he could have showed his love harder, could have found maybe the stages, like what if he could have done this? What if he could have, you know, been more attentive to the systems, you know, to the symptoms? You know, how would you comment on how to relieve the guilt that kind of nags with the increase and incessantly at times?
Yeah. Yeah. You know, I appreciate that too, Adam. You know, there's one writer, and they suggest that, you know, that sometimes the regrets we feel are more powerful for what we didn't do than what we did do. And we regret the stuff we might have left on the table. And so if we feel like we could have done better, I do think that um, that person who wrote that question, that there's a lot of potential there if they were open to it, to think about a writing kind of exercise or an imaginational type of exercise, to say that if you know, if he was able to express that regret and that wish I could have, you know, to his wife, who he loved and wished more than anything that she would have lived and didn't have to suffer. And if he had a chance to express that to her, and then she could respond, knowing her as he does, what would she say back? You know, what would be her hopes for him, seeing that he is having to carry that burden and feels that the weight of that? What would he say if the roles were switched? And his wife was carrying the burden because she wished she could have been a better caregiver to him. You know, what would he hope for her in that kind of a time?
Thank you, Greg. That was a great insight. And Eric and Greg, you know, thank you both so much for sharing your experiences with the audience. I mean, it's vulnerable, very vulnerable and hard to share stories. And Eric, especially, thank you, for being vulnerable and being willing to share that with the audience tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes.
So, and
to share, it really does.
Mm-hmm. And so I just want to thank our audience for joining us tonight. We want to invite you to join us every fourth Wednesday of the month for our Zoom workshops, usually around 8:30 Eastern time. Our next event will be held on April 24th at 8:30. And we just hope everybody has a great rest of your evening and join us again. We look forward to having you join us again. Have a great night.
All right. Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.